Good evening, and welcome to this evening's Latino Arts Project Art Talk Lecture Series featuring scholar, author, and activist Leah Rothstein. My name is Dave Monaco, and it is my privilege to serve as your master of ceremonies of sorts this evening. Among my roles in the Dallas community, I serve as the facilitator of United to Learn's policy study. United to Learn serves over 25,000 students and 2,600 educators in 50 Dallas ISD elementary schools. Through partnerships with businesses, high schools, faith organizations, and engaged individuals and groups, we work to accelerate student achievement. As part of the study's investigation of inequities in the housing system back in November, our cohort members had the opportunity to read excerpts of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, authored by Richard Rothstein, the father of tonight's speaker. Since its release in 2017, The Color of Law has become a New York Times bestseller, sold over 1 million copies, and informed conversations around systemic inequities in our communities. At the crux of Richard Rothstein's exhaustive research is that, as he writes in the preface of the book, African Americans were unconstitutionally denied the means and the right to integration in middle-class neighborhoods. And because this denial was state-sponsored, the nation is obligated to remedy it. Richard Rothstein explored some of these remedies in The Color of Law, but it is in the forthcoming sequel to Color of Law, entitled Just Action, that Richard and Leah Rothstein delve more deeply into remedies to close the equity gaps born of decades of de jure and de facto segregation. Leah will speak with us tonight about the position she and her father stake in Just Action. We are grateful indeed to have Leah Rothstein here with us this evening to help us better understand how the fabric of our community has been sewn and to share her thoughts on what can be done to restitch it in an equitable fashion. As noted, Leah has co-authored a sequel to The Color of Law with her father called Just Action. It will be released in June. She has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government, leading in Alameda County and San Francisco probation department's research on reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy practice and finance. Please join me in welcoming Leah Rothstein. Leah.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for your patience and help in getting into this room. So I'm going to start tonight by talking about this idea of de facto segregation. It's a term that was mentioned in the intro. It's how, we've come to understand how our communities are racially segregated. I know what little I learned about racial segregation in high school was this concept. It tells us that the racial segregation of the South, of lunch counters and buses and transportation, schools, restaurants, that was required by law, but that residential segregation, the racial segregation of our communities, is something entirely different. The de facto segregation idea tells us that it was private actors that created our residential segregation. So it was banks, mortgage lenders, realtors, landlords who refused to give mortgages or sell or rent homes to African Americans in white communities, and that's why we're racially so separated in how we live. Or the de facto segregation idea tells us that it's just personal choice. We like to live around people who look like us, and so that's why our communities look the way they do. And we look around and we see how segregated our country is now. Everywhere across the country, cities, suburbs, all communities are racially segregated. And we think it's too bad that it happened like this, but something that happened naturally, as this did, can only unhappen naturally. There's nothing we can do about it. And the Supreme Court has agreed with this view. Chief Justice John Roberts a few years ago wrote in an opinion saying that because the federal government had nothing to do with creating racially segregated communities, that it has no obligation or no role to play in challenging that segregation. Well, as the gentleman who introduced me mentioned, my father, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law in 2017, and in that book he called this de facto segregation idea a myth. He said that sure, there were private actors that helped to create our segregated communities, but their actions were incentivized and often required by the government. Government at all levels, federal, state, local government, took these actions that were as unconstitutional as the actions of the government in the South that segregated lunch counters and buses and schools and restaurants. Maybe a little bit less disguised sometimes, but often not, often just as explicitly as those laws in the South, these same laws that segregated our residential communities all across the country. As much a violation of the Constitution of the 5th and 14th Amendments as these laws in the South. And yet we have done nothing to remedy this. We clearly have an obligation to do something about it. Our government took unconstitutional action that still has effects today on all of us, but nobody has done anything to change that. I'm going to give a couple of examples about how the government contributed to our racial landscape and how we live today. So one is public housing. So we think of public housing now as places where mostly poor people live, right? They tend to be underemployed or unemployed. They're areas of concentrated poverty, buildings of concentrated poverty and disadvantage, and the buildings are poorly maintained. That's how we've come to understand public housing, but that's not how public housing began. So public housing began in the 1930s. It was part of the New Deal during the Great Depression, and it was built for working families, not for the unemployed. There were a lot of unemployed people in the Great Depression, but public housing wasn't built for those people. It was built for working families who couldn't find housing because no housing was being built in the Depression. So the federal government came in to build this housing for working families, but built segregated public housing projects, built some projects specifically for whites and some specifically for African Americans. Now it came into cities and built these public housing projects in cities that were integrated, racially integrated before the public housing projects came. So one example, this happened all over the country, but one example from Cleveland, Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet and playwright, he wrote an autobiography and talked about growing up in downtown Cleveland. He talked about his neighborhood being racially integrated, his high school was racially integrated, his best friend and girlfriend in high school were white. This is not how downtown Cleveland looks today. It's very racially segregated. And that's due in large part because in this time, the federal government came in and built public housing for working families in downtown Cleveland, separate buildings, separate projects, separate developments for whites and for African Americans, and that created the racial landscape of that city. Another example, after World War II, when war veterans were coming home from the war, millions of them, they started families, they started the baby boom, and these families needed housing. It was after, so the Great Depression, again, no housing was being built. During World War II, it was illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes. So no housing was built then either. So workers came home from the war, started families, and didn't have anywhere to live. So again, the government saw this problem and decided to do something about it, and decided to help build suburbs for these working families, these white working families, to live in. Now at the time, we weren't a very suburbanized country like we are now. People pretty much lived in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy at the time. Factories were located in urban areas to be near their ports and rail lines to transport their goods, and the businesses to support those factories had to be located nearby. Workers lived near those factories and businesses because there wasn't the public transportation systems we have today or the highway system we have today. So most people lived fairly close to urban centers. But when the federal government decided to step in and help build housing for white workers after World War II, they decided to take those white workers and move them to the suburbs outside of the inner city. And so one example of this, which if you've read Color of Law, you've heard of, and you may have heard of otherwise, is Levittown, which is in New York, east of New York City. So Levittown was built by a developer named William Levitt. he decided he wanted to build 17,000 homes for workers who couldn't find a place to live in New York. 17,000 homes is a lot of homes to build. He didn't have the money for that personally to finance it. He couldn't get a bank loan to build 17,000 homes because he didn't have buyers lined up, and we weren't a suburban society, so banks thought it was pretty speculative and kind of crazy to finance him. So the only way he could get financing to build Levittown was by the federal government insuring his bank loan. And the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration, would provide this bank loan guarantee if William Levitt agreed to only sell his homes to whites. Now, this happened in suburbs across the country, not just Levittown, that's just an example. But the Federal Housing Administration went farther than that. It said that it wouldn't help support suburbs and developments being built even anywhere near an African American community because, and I quote from the Federal Housing Administration manual, it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So this was not an accident, and this was not private actors creating this. This was explicit government policy written in a manual that said that we had to separate races, and it would only help finance these developments if the developers agreed to do so. There's a photo in The Color of Law of a wall that's 6 feet high, half a mile wide, half a mile long, in Detroit, that the developer who wanted to build a new development, a new suburb, that this developer was required to build that wall to separate his new development, his white development, from a nearby African American neighborhood, was required by the Federal Housing Administration in order to get the financing he needed to build that subdivision. So again, this notion of de facto segregation is nonsense. It's a myth that we've come to believe that has no basis in reality. Now, the 1968 Fair Housing Act came along and said that it was illegal going forward to discriminate on the basis of race in the sale or rental of housing, which is a good thing. But that act did nothing to address this disparity. So it's almost an empty promise to say, look, we'll no longer discriminate. African Americans can buy homes anywhere now, when they're no longer affordable to working families, and government policy have kept those families from accumulating the wealth they need to be able to afford those homes. So a forward-looking act like the Fair Housing Act doesn't address the disparity that already exists because of past government action that doesn't allow for the equity that we want to see in the housing market today. So in addition to the wealth gap, the segregated neighborhoods that we live in, caused by government policy, are to blame for many of our most serious social problems. Segregated neighborhoods lead to disparities in health, in income, incarceration rates, education, exposure to crime, many other aspects of life between African Americans and whites, children and adults. African American children who grow up in segregated neighborhoods, they live in communities with more pollution, more exposure to lead paint, more stress, less access to healthy food, more crime and violence, and they suffer more from lead poisoning and asthma as children. And then they grow up to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cancer, and shorter life expectancies than whites. These segregated neighborhoods also lead to the educational disparities we see in our country. So when a neighborhood is segregated and lacks resources and has all of these problems that I mentioned, higher pollution rates, lack of access to healthy food, all of the children who show up to a school in that neighborhood are dealing with one or more of these challenges. No matter how good that school is and how wonderful the teachers in that school are, they'll be overwhelmed by a student population that's dealing with all of these challenges to learning. And so the education of everyone in that school suffers, and that's why we see the educational disparities we see today, which then lead to future income disparities and higher education disparities. And what we need to do this is we need to start a movement that begins locally in our own communities. So we understand that in order to see the change that we want to see, that we will need eventually large, massive federal interventions and investments, to make change on these issues. But we also aren't naive, and we understand that there isn't the federal political will right now to make those changes on the national level. But there's a lot that can be done locally in our own communities. There's a lot that is under local control that we don't need to wait for the federal government to change policy to act on. So that's why we argue for starting local committees and starting a movement locally that can then bubble up to achieve federal change eventually. So the strategies we talk about, they fall into two major categories. The first one is involved in increasing investment and resources in lower income, predominantly African American communities that are segregated and where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government-sponsored segregation and government policy. Now these strategies that increase investment in these under-resourced communities, they also include strategies to prevent the displacement in those communities as they start to see more investment. It's inevitable that people with higher incomes will want to move in and the prices in those communities will rise. Some call this gentrification. And it threatens to displace the people who lived in those communities for a long time when the resources weren't there. And so we also need policies to prevent that displacement. And those kinds of policies include things like rent control to kind of limit how fast rents can rise in a community, just cause eviction ordinances, which make it illegal to evict tenants unless there's a just cause like failure to pay rent, and a policy called inclusionary zoning, which is a zoning policy that requires that when new market rate housing is built in a community, that the developer has to set aside a certain percentage of those units and reserve them for lower or moderate income households. So that's a way to make sure that if a community is gentrifying and there's lots of new market rate housing being built, that some of it will be affordable to lower and moderate income households to prevent some of that displacement that will happen. So one of the strategies that falls into this category involves Section 8. So Section 8, many of us have probably heard of this program. It's the largest federal rental subsidy program in the country. It provides rental vouchers to over 2 million low-income households. They are predominantly African American, disproportionately African American households. There's another 8 million low-income households who are eligible for Section 8 but don't get vouchers because the program is underfunded. Also another talk for another time. But 2 million is a lot of families that get this benefit. And what happens when you get a voucher is, unlike a public housing recipient whose benefit comes in a building, in a unit in a public housing building, a Section 8 tenant can use their Section 8 voucher to rent anywhere in the private market. And most of us, we want to live in neighborhoods with well-resourced schools, access to parks and jobs and transportation, access to good retail. We call these neighborhoods of high opportunity. And children who grow up in these areas do better. They have better income, education, health outcomes. Parents have less stress and depression. But these high opportunity communities are often designed to keep low-income people out by ensuring that the only housing available in the community is too expensive for them to afford. And so Section 8 had the intention when it was created and has the potential to address this by allowing lower income people to rent anywhere in the private market. But only 5% of Section 8 recipients live in high opportunity neighborhoods nationwide. So we got in touch with a firm here in Dallas in researching this book that it's a mission-driven for-profit company that buys single-family homes in these high opportunity communities and rents them to Section 8 voucher holders. Now this works, financially for this firm because of the small area rents, so they can charge enough in rent that's, that's in the market range of the market rents in those communities that they can make enough that it makes sense to buy these homes and rent them to Section 8 participants. And they like doing this. I just talked with a landlord right before this who's featured in our book who prefers renting to Section 8 tenants because they're more stable, they don't move as often as other tenants, they take good care of her properties. So one community, I don't know if you all have heard about this lawsuit happening in Providence Village, which is outside of Dallas. So that's a community with 2,000 homes, mostly white, middle-class community. And there's 157, or there were 157 Section 8 households renting in that community, predominantly African American women-headed households. And a little while ago, the Homeownership Association in Providence Village voted to ban Section 8 tenants from their village. So all of the Section 8 tenants had to be served eviction notices, and if they aren't evicted in a certain amount of time, landlords are charged $300 a week for not evicting their Section 8 tenants. So they did this in the middle of a school year, so some of the tenants left to try to get into a new home and not disrupt their kids' school year too much. But some of them waited it out a little bit, and there's been lawsuits. HUD and the Department of Justice is investigating a lawsuit, and they've stayed the order for now, so it can't go through with it. But they are investigating the racially discriminatory intent and impact of this law or this rule in the village. And apparently it's not the only suburb. There's a couple others around Providence Village that have passed similarly discriminatory laws or rules. I guess they're not called laws if they're homeownership associations, but rules for their villages. And it can't be that everybody in these communities supports these exclusionary tactics. In fact, the woman I was talking to before, she said that in Providence Village, the homeownership association sort of misrepresented what they were going to do. And so a lot of the homeowners in that area feel kind of duped. They didn't know that the Section 8 tenants were going to be evicted right away. And they probably wouldn't have supported this move if they had known that. And so a group working on these issues of redressing segregation could find those people, organize them, and get them to pressure their homeownership association to change their policies about this. And then also addressing the less obvious ways that African Americans are excluded from homeownership now. So we talked about restrictive covenants, which was a very obvious way that African Americans were excluded from homeownership in the past. But there's less obvious ways that are still in effect today, or still having an impact today. And one is the credit scoring system. So we all probably have heard of credit scores. They're supposed to be an impartial, objective rating of our future likelihood to repay a debt. So banks use them to decide if you're a good candidate for a mortgage. If you have a high credit score, you're more likely to be approved for a mortgage and get a better interest rate than if you have a low credit score. And these objective ratings are based on your financial history. So if you've defaulted on a loan in the past, you'll have a lower credit score, and that makes some sense. But the problem is that they're only based on a certain type of financial history, and it's a type of financial history that whites are more likely to have than African Americans. And part of the reason for that is because African American neighborhoods have fewer banks and the kinds of financial institutions whose products go into a credit score algorithm. They're more likely to have payday loans and other sort of non-traditional financial institutions. And even a payday loan with a hugely exorbitant interest rate, someone who pays that off completely, doesn't default, that doesn't benefit them in their credit score. Similarly, if someone has been a renter for their whole life and has never had a mortgage, which is more often the case with African Americans than whites when applying for a mortgage, you could have been a renter for your entire life and never missed a rent payment. And that should show that you're a good candidate for paying a future mortgage, especially because mortgage payments are often lower than current rents. But past rent payments don't factor into a credit score. And so that's a policy that's not maybe intentionally discriminatory against African Americans, but it has a discriminatory impact because it excludes them from mortgages that they should be qualified for and they'd be very able to pay off like anyone else would. And so there's some movement on the national level to change the credit scoring algorithm nationally to take into account rental payment history. But there's some real movement lately, but the conversation was started, I was just talking to somebody in 2006, so it's taken almost 20 years to do that. So while we wait for that to continue to be fleshed out, there's a lot we can do locally on this, and that is working with our local banks and mortgage lenders and credit unions, and they can start taking into account rental payment history into their own credit scoring algorithms. And some have done this, local banks and credit unions, and it makes a big difference in boosting the credit score of African American potential borrowers and opening up access to mortgages and homeownership opportunities for them. That's another thing we can do locally while we wait for federal policy change to happen. So that's a few examples that we talk about in Just Action. There's a lot more in the book and a lot more outside of the book. We're going to start a column around when the book comes out on Substack that will continue to talk about more strategies that we come across that didn't get to be included in the book and update the ones that are there, because the second you put it down on paper, it changes, because everything in this issue is constantly changing these days. There's a lot of strategies and a lot of ways to start working on this issue, and some might argue, if you get into the weeds in the policy debates around this, people argue whether we should support or focus on one of these categories over the other, that one is more important than the other. But we believe that there's so much that needs to be changed and so much to do and so many opportunities to create change around these issues that we'll need all of them eventually, all of these strategies and all of these changes. So we just need to get started somewhere. And I hope that I gave some ideas of, at least sparked some thinking or inspiration, and at least to understand that there's not nothing to be done. So thank you for listening, and I believe we have some time for questions.